In 1980, one man stood before a newly free nation and preached forgiveness to the very people who had imprisoned him for 11 years. The world called him a hero. Universities showered him with honorary degrees. A British queen would later knight him. 37 years later, that same man sat under house arrest while tanks surrounded his mansion, placed there by the army he had commanded for decades. His country's money had become so worthless that a $100 trillion banknote could not buy a loaf of bread. His name was Robert Mugabe, and his story is one of the most dramatic transformations in modern history. Robert Gabriel Mugabe was born in 1924 at Kutama Mission, in what was then the British colony of southern Rhodesia. Raised by Jesuit priests after his father abandoned the family, young Robert was a quiet, bookish boy who preferred reading to playing. Teachers described him as brilliant and solitary. He became a school teacher, and over his lifetime he would earn 7 university degrees, several of them completed by correspondence from inside a prison cell. Education would remain his obsession, and later, one of his greatest legacies. In the late 1950s, Mugabe taught in Ghana, the first African colony to win independence. There, he witnessed Kwame Nkrumah's revolution firsthand, and there he met his first wife, Sally. He returned home in 1960, a changed man, convinced that white minority rule in Rhodesia had to end. Before we continue, take 1 second to subscribe and tap the notification bell because this story is about to take some incredible turns. Rhodesia in the 1960s was one of the most rigid racial states on Earth. A small white minority controlled the government, the best farmland, and the economy, while millions of black Africans lived without political rights. When Britain pushed for majority rule, Prime Minister Ian Smith refused, and in 1965 he declared independence unilaterally rather than share power. Mugabe joined the nationalist movement and quickly rose through its ranks as a fiery speaker. In 1964, he was arrested for his political activities and would spend the next 11 years behind bars. Prison hardened him. While he was inside, his only son died of malaria. The Rhodesian authorities refused to let him attend the funeral. Those close to him later said something in Mugabe changed forever after that refusal. Released in 1974, Mugabe slipped across the border into Mozambique and took command of ZANU, one of the 2 main liberation movements fighting the Rhodesian government. The bush war that followed lasted years and cost tens of thousands of lives on all sides. By the late 1970s, the conflict had exhausted the country, and all parties were pushed toward the negotiating table. At Lancaster House in London in 1979, a deal was struck. Rhodesia would become Zimbabwe, with elections open to all. Land reform, the most explosive issue of all, was largely postponed, a compromise that would echo for decades. In the 1980 elections, Mugabe won in a landslide that stunned observers. Many expected revenge. Instead, the new prime minister went on national television and preached reconciliation, telling white Zimbabweans that the wrongs of the past must stand forgiven and forgotten. The world was captivated. Zimbabwe became the toast of the international community, and in those early years, the results were real. Mugabe poured resources into schools and clinics, and Zimbabwe achieved one of the highest literacy rates on the African continent. The country was called the breadbasket of southern Africa, exporting food to its neighbors. But beneath the applause, another story was unfolding. In the early 1980s, tensions erupted between Mugabe's government and supporters of his rival, Joshua Nkomo, in the Matabeleland region. Government forces launched a security campaign there that became known as Gukurahundi. What happened remains one of the most painful chapters in Zimbabwe's history. Some accounts suggest thousands of civilians lost their lives, and historians continue to debate the full scale and responsibility. Mugabe himself later called the era a moment of madness, though he never offered a full apology. By 1987, Nkomo's party had been absorbed into Mugabe's, and the prime minister became an executive president with sweeping powers. Zimbabwe was now, in practice, a one-party state with one man at its center. Through the 1990s, the economy weakened and frustration grew. Veterans of the Liberation War demanded the land they had been promised. And in 2000, after voters rejected a constitutional referendum, the government backed a wave of farm seizures that transferred most white-owned commercial farms, often through chaotic and sometimes violent takeovers, according to numerous reports from the period. Agricultural production collapsed, foreign investment fled, and then came one of the most extraordinary economic events in modern history: hyperinflation. By 2008, prices in Zimbabwe were doubling almost daily. The central bank printed banknotes with more and more zeros until it finally issued a $100 trillion bill, the largest denomination ever printed in history. Workers' salaries became worthless between morning and evening. Shops stood empty. Millions of Zimbabweans left the country to survive. That same year, Mugabe faced the strongest electoral challenge of his life from opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai. When the first round did not go the government's way, a campaign of intimidation swept the country, according to international observers, and Tsvangirai withdrew from the runoff, citing danger to his supporters. A tense power-sharing government followed, but real control never left Mugabe's hands. And still, he refused to name a successor. Into his late 80s and then his 90s, Mugabe held on. The world's oldest head of state, increasingly frail, sometimes dozing at public events, while a battle raged behind him over who would inherit power. At the center of that battle stood his second wife, Grace, 41 years his junior, ambitious and openly positioning herself for the presidency. Her faction pushed out rival after rival. And in November 2017, Mugabe fired his vice president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, a war veteran with deep ties to the military. It was one move too far. Days later, armored vehicles rolled into Harare. Generals appeared on state television insisting this was not a takeover, merely an operation against criminals around the president. Mugabe was placed under house arrest. Hundreds of thousands of Zimbabweans flooded the streets, celebrating openly for the first time in a generation. For nearly a week, the old man refused to resign. Then, on November 21, 2017, as Parliament began impeachment proceedings, a letter arrived. After 37 years, Robert Mugabe's rule was over. He was 93 years old. He died 2 years later, in September 2019, in a hospital in Singapore, far from the country he had ruled for so long. So how should history remember Robert Mugabe? To some, he remains a liberation hero, the teacher who freed his people and educated a nation, then paid the price for defying Western powers. To others, he is the man who took one of Africa's most promising countries and presided over its collapse, clinging to power long after the dream had died. Perhaps both stories are true, and perhaps that is the tragedy, that the man who gave Zimbabwe its freedom could never grant it the one thing it needed most: the freedom to move on without him. If this story gripped you, watch our documentary on Mobutu Sese Seko next, another liberation-era leader whose decades in power ended in dramatic collapse. The link is on your screen and in the description. Make sure you are subscribed with notifications on so you never miss an episode. We release new videos every week. Until next time, remember, Africa's history is world history. This has been the African Chronicle.